2, 1. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. We have a lot of news to cover, so let's just get started. Our first story today is another fascinating piece coming to us from the Washington Post, written by Joseph Allen, who is the director of the Harvard University Healthy Buildings Program, which I thought was very interesting at first sight. Now, Allen is the co-author also of a book, Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity, which sounds interesting, right? Also makes him sound like he might know what he's talking about when it comes to, how should I say, coronavirus in an enclosed environment. And that is sort of his scope. And that is really the backdrop theme for the article that he's written. And really the main point in this article is that kids should go back to school this fall because nationwide school closures in the brief time that we've seen have already resulted in some otherwise preventable circumstances that are really detrimental for students and for families. So, for example, Allen notes that there has been a spike in virtual dropouts in the city of Boston. Allen states, quote, 20% of Boston high school students didn't log into class in May, in the entire month, and only half of the elementary school children in Philadelphia made daily contact. Only half in the entire city of Philadelphia. So clearly, while it's a viable option, meaning we can do distance learning, clearly students aren't learning the same way, and it's not the same sort of productive environment, and that's what Joseph Allen is trying to talk about. Now, he also mentions that, again, students are not learning in the same way, and that school closures also, by the way, are disproportionately hurting some communities more than other communities. Women, for example, single parents, low to middle income communities, which thereby widens the education gap and other racial inequalities and other unequal circumstances that we are not trying to exacerbate. So the point is there, closing down the schools may have actually in some cases widened the gaps or the burdens that are placed on certain communities of people in this country even more so, which was not the goal at all. The goal was to keep people safe, and we've done that in some cases, and we'll talk about the fact that there really haven't been any children deaths from the coronavirus in schools, at least according to one study. However, what's important is that there are a lot of unsavory side effects that are going on with the shutdown and school closures, and these are some of the examples that Allen is talking about, and I don't really see this covered much, so I want to talk about it. We've also seen that schools are so overwhelmed with the transition to virtual classrooms and just virtual schooling overall that we've seen schools cancel classes, we've seen certain school districts effectively end the school year early, which really does create a crisis, for example, for working parents or for single working parents, low to middle income working parents, people who can't afford daycare, who count on their kids to be at school all day long, who also count on their kids and federal programs to help feed their children. And that's another thing that gets canceled when school gets canceled. So it's like, on one hand, we really do need to be as safe as we can, but on the other hand, we do need to weigh all of our options, and I don't think it's as easy as either we go this way or this way, clear fork in the road with giant signs and pointed arrows that light up saying good decision, bad decision, good decision, bad decision. I don't think it's that easy. I don't think it works that way. Now, in addition to these key points that Allen's making, which are some really, really, really strong points, by the way, he highlights the fact that millions of children, as I was just saying, nationwide rely on federal programs that supply free or reduced cost hot meals to children. So children who otherwise cannot eat at home because maybe they can't even afford to, would be able to go to school and get a hot meal. And when a school closes, so does that program. So you literally have some kids who are gaining weight because they're more sedentary just living at home, not being active going to school every day. Meanwhile, we also have some kids who are relying on going to school for meals and are now losing weight and on the risk of various different negative health impacts. And his point is really clear, at least to me. There are several negative impacts on the lives of students, parents, and school faculty when schools are shut down. Now, I would also like to add, by the way, that schools, again, here have been forced to lay off large portions of their staff due to their circumstances. My mother is an administrator for the largest charter school in the state of California, and they have this has taken a great toll on them, and this has taken a great toll on many other school districts who now can't afford to keep certain staff or certain programs or certain extracurricular activities or even certain programs for kids going. So this has been really, really detrimental to the health of our school ecosystem as a whole. Now, again, I don't want to simply ignore the fact that the lockdown has been successful in some ways. So let's talk about that a little bit. The lockdown has successfully prevented, at least according to one study, first of all, COVID-19 deaths in children overall, period, which is really, really good. That's one study coming out of Switzerland, being reported by the Washington Post. Of thousands of children in that study that were infected, not one single child succumbed to the disease. 100% recovery rate, which is really, really impressive. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's just because, I'm not a virologist or a biologist, but that's very interesting. And this means that at least to some extent, the lockdown measures have worked. They have been successful in preventing the spread of the disease and preventing the hospitals, the healthcare system from being overwhelmed, which again was another goal. We didn't want the healthcare system to be overflowed. We did not want to overburden them, give them a load that they could not carry. And so some of these lockdown measures, at least in part, were necessary and worked. So we have to acknowledge that. That's true. So that's absolutely the case. However, there have also been some terrible side effects, including people who've been laid off work and now have their kids staying at home with them, and so they don't have a job, their kid can't go to school. What are they to do? What are people to do? So I know we don't want, at first it was about making sure that there isn't a long line at the hospital, but we also don't want a long line at the food bank or at the Goodwill, right? We want we want people's lives to remain intact. Now, Allen and his team at Harvard University also compiled a list of safety protocols, by the way, that really do explain some of the decrease in the infection rate of healthcare workers who are on the front lines, which might be surprising to you. It was surprising to me. But this article, Allen is actually claiming that among the people working on the front lines, there has been a decrease in the infection rate. And he thinks it's due to a change in certain safety protocols. And he thinks that if maybe schools adopt some of these safety protocols, then we can actually go back to school in the fall. I'm starting a master's program, and my university does plan on resuming classes in person this fall. As they have stated, the president of the University of San Diego has released a plan, a 6-point plan that you can watch, and in which he talks about gradually reopening the campus. The classrooms are big, the class sizes are small, so we can do this safely and effectively with some of the points that Allen makes, which are, number one, create a culture of safety and collective responsibility as a priority. You want a health above all else mindset. That's what you want, just as a base. You want a culture that promotes health and safety above all else, which seems maybe obvious, but still good to point out. Number two, stay home if you are sick or even symptomatic, regardless if it's the common cold or the flu or the shakes or vomiting or nausea. If you feel sick at all, you don't feel well, I should say, if you do not feel well, if you do not feel like yourself, stay home. Do not take any risks. This is not the time to take any risks. We do not need any heroes. Number three, frequently wash your hands. Wash your hands a lot. Maybe it seems annoying, but every time you go out, wash your hands. Every time you touch something else, wash your hands. Every time you touch your face, wash your hands, wash your face. Keep hand sanitizer nearby and use it frequently. Now that brings me to the next point. Wear masks, and wear those frequently, although with scheduled breaks. You can plan it so that if you're physically distanced enough, you don't need to wear a mask. Maybe if you're the only person in your car and you're driving, maybe you don't need to wear a mask, but then wear one as soon as you get out of the car, stuff like that, which also, like I just said in there, keep a nice physical distance from people, do not come too close when speaking to anybody, and really do not touch. If you can, try not to touch other people, limit contact, and also limit contact with yourself. Do not touch your face, do not touch your mouth, do not touch your eyes or other, in points of infection, possibly. Now, finally, Allen does note that we really did not have to do things the way that we did it. And I think that what he's saying is that we really did not respond as prudently as we could have, and there are certain other countries with other models, Sweden, for example, that handled this, in my opinion, and I believe in Alan's opinion, more efficiently and more productively than the United States did, and so they were able to contain the virus without taking such a huge hit. So we were able to contain the virus a little bit. And I believe our death rate is around 4 to 5%, and the highest we've seen is like 15%. So we're about middle of the road, especially compared to European countries. However, we probably could have done this more prudently, more thoughtfully, and less disastrously. Now, Alan also notes that this really is about risk tolerance at the end of the day. When you decide to, hey, do we want to homeschool? Do we want to send our kid back to school? What do we want to do? Do we want to open the school or close the school? This is about risk tolerance, which is something that we tolerate every day, right? We are every single day we're making risk tolerance calculations. Every single time you get behind the wheel of a car and get on a freeway, get on a road, even get in the car, you're making a risk. If you own a firearm, you're making a risk. If you have a drink, you're taking a risk. If you step on an airplane or go outside, you're taking a risk. You're constantly, all day long in your entire life, making risk value assessments and deciding how much risk am I willing to tolerate. So just like that, we have to decide with our school system, how much risk are we willing to tolerate, and is sending our kids back to school worth the risk? Alan says yes, and I do too. Now, moving on to another piece from the Washington Post written by Kathleen Parker, a very interesting op-ed that some parts I thought were really interesting and I agreed with. Other parts I still found interesting but didn't really agree with, and that's what makes an article fun for me, is when someone is, challenging what I think. That's healthy. And this is an article written about, by the way, this controversial newfound legacy about the former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, who for like 80 years, 100 years, basically from the time in office until through the rest of his life until after, for 80 years, he's been known as a person and as a statue as one of the most progressive presidents in U.S. history and one of the most progressive world leaders in history, period, unequivocally. And somehow that's changed on a dime. And it's because we're using modern lenses to look at things from the great past. Not the great past. I mean, we're using modern lenses and applying modern logic and modern values to things in the past, and especially things that are so far in the past, culturally, chronologically, that people at that time wouldn't even be able to foresee the values that we have today. And that's the problem. We do this thing where we apply 2020 values to people like 1865, and we'll say stuff like, oh, well, if I was born in 1800, then I definitely would have known better than to do this. Let me tell you something. No, you would have not. No, you would have not. Just like you don't know what people are going to do in the year 3000, or in the year 2100, or in the year 2200. I highly doubt that if you were to go back in time to 1800, you would do, I mean, maybe you would, but I highly doubt that you would do anything that would be incredibly deviant from the mainstream, window or spectrum of human behavior, especially this idea that you would be acting like someone with 2020 values in the year 1800. I mean, it's preposterous. Of course it's preposterous. And that doesn't make you a bad person to admit that, because human beings are both products and victims of their time. And that's one of the things about life, and we can learn from those lessons, and we can make things better now. But trust me, there will come a day where people in the year 3000 will look upon what we're doing now, and at least at some of what we're doing, and they'll say, how ridiculous, how absurd, how preposterous, but we're products of our time. We have limitations. We can't just foresee how people will be, and that's the problem with some of this woke stuff, where there's no limiting principle. It just goes on endlessly forever. You could just endlessly apply it to anything forever. Everybody who was born before me is wrong. All the good people are living now. But then there will be different people living in 100 years who will say we're the bad people, even though we're the people that want to be woke. And it will just keep going on and on and on and on forever. And that's the problem with all this stuff. And in recent weeks, there have been several attempts, I should say, that really do scare me, to tear down statues of historical figures in the United States, which is a move that is, I think, being bipartisan, being criticized by at least some people on both sides of the aisle, maybe not in the political parties, but certainly online. There are definitely mixed feelings about this issue, even with this journalist, Kathleen Parker. In any case, there was once beauty seen in this statue of, again, arguably our most progressive president in U.S. history, perhaps maybe next to FDR. But now, really, this has become an ugly sight, according to Kathleen Parker, really for the outrage mob. And Parker writes, quote, "In the midst of today's era of outrage, Roosevelt's legacy is being viewed in a different, more modern light. With passions fully engaged after the death of George Floyd in police custody, everything is in question, and some, it would seem, want to delete history altogether," which is absolutely true. This is what's happening right now. This is what's happening right now. Pay attention. This is what's going on right now. There are people who literally are trying to rewrite history. That is what is going on right now. There are people who, look, I'm not saying I'm proud of evil in history. Evil is evil and it's indefensible. But it's good to be able to point to it and say, hey, that evil thing happened. Now, for example, you might find big events such as even World War II and the Holocaust, in which certain people want to deny that it ever happened. And you know why that won't ever make sense, thankfully, to most people? Because there are living people who say, look at Auschwitz. Look at it. It's still standing. It's living proof of one of the worst things that has ever happened in human history. It's living proof. You can't deny it. You cannot deny the evil that was Nazi Germany. Because we have proof that it was there. We have it now. So I would say similarly, statues for good and that represent good and evil and mixed bags are important, not good, but important, because we can point to them and say, you can't deny history. You can't rewrite it. You can't erase it. The good happened, but so did the evil. So did the evil. And you can't erase it. You can't erase it that way. But if you tear down a statue and you literally erase it, then yeah, people can deny it. And you're going to enable people who want to deny the evils of history, including in this country. So I don't see how this empowers justice at all, or brings us closer toward peace. I say that with a much different, socio-political, historical context here, right? Obviously. But I'm just saying that when you have proof, the evidence of the crime, then the crime cannot be denied. So to erase evidence because it's hard to look at for some people, which is so understandable, but to erase it means that you're empowering the people who want to deny that it ever happened at all. And that is really something that I think people need to take into consideration that maybe people aren't really thinking about. And I just think that my brothers and sisters who are interested in justice need to understand that if we just completely uninvent history and uninvent the West, not only will we be left with a shadow of the world that we had, but also everyone we will be so increasingly divided, so even more polarized. Imagine everybody in a whole society telling themselves one version of the story. Imagine everybody just being in their own camp, not even having parties anymore because nobody can agree on anything at all. That's where we're going. I don't see how this brings us any closer toward, healing division at all. And in such a politically charged atmosphere, there are bound to be ideas that are, good and and revolutionary, and some that are also disastrous. And I understand that, maybe it's about just letting people, vent and air things out, but I really don't think that erasing history like that is going to solve the problems or bring us closer to equality or to racial justice. I don't understand it. And Parker really does highlight the core of this sort of cultural phenomenon that is resulting in this interesting analysis of the past through a very contemporary woke lens of some 21st century Twitter activist. And that definitely explains, at least for me, the nonsensical nature of this entire thing. How could you apply 2020 values to someone who lived 300 years ago? It's just preposterous to me. And I think that, because people are victims and products of their time, when we look at history, we have to keep that in mind. People are products and victims of their time. And it's not defending people, but the difference is understanding history so that we know why things happen and we can prevent them from happening again. That's the end goal, right? I think the end goal is the same here, right? Prevent those things from happening again. Then this is what we need to do. Face the history, face the music, and say, hey, it happened. We see it. Every day we see it. And we're reminded that we need to be better. And that's, I think, a really, really valuable, important thing. And I just don't think that this 2020 wokester vision for a politician in 1900 is going to do, really bring us any closer to the justice that we seek. However, people will be people, and they will continue on with their quest. So, getting back to this article, as for the statue, it's important again to realize that if we tear it down, then we no longer have something to point to in honor of the ugly, evil history that we want to fix, that we do not want to be repeated. If there is a statue that represents inequalities in this country, that is demonstrative of that superiority or supremacy mindset, then we can't deny that was a problem that was rife in this country. And we have to admit that we live with the legacy of it today still. Now, in any case, there is a statue of Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, that I should mention, that is in question, that sits right in front of the Natural History Museum, in which he is atop a horse. Beside him, there is one indigenous gentleman, and there is one African gentleman, and they're both sort of guiding him on his, safari hunt, if you will. Teddy Roosevelt was a great outdoorsman who really boosted the national park system and, land reservations and all stuff like that, which is all, was at least really good, especially in the eyes of environmentalists up until just a couple of days ago. And these men were guiding, at least according to the author, and I would agree with this, these men are guiding him in the art of hunting and gathering. Now, however, history sort of gets lost in translation, and the statue is being widely criticized as truly actually a display of superiority and servitude. However, and I look, I want to understand, because that there's probably a little bit of that. There was maybe a little bit of that. Actually, I don't know. I don't want to make that assumption. I don't feel that privileged that I get to assume what was going on. Maybe all those gentlemen were there consensually together as friends. Maybe that happened. So I'm not going to make any assumptions. And I think a lot of people online just want to go make assumptions and be online activists. Parker, in any case, writes the following quote: "Had the two other men accompanying Roosevelt also been on horseback, would the statue have been more acceptable? I wonder. As it stands, activists, as well as the museum itself, have decided that's the Natural History Museum in New York City, have decided that the trio's hierarchical construction implies superiority and servitude. In fact, the standing men were intended to represent guides in the places Roosevelt liked to hunt and survey. They were helpers. Helpers. In other words, not slaves, but never mind. Historical accuracy is no obstacle to self-absorbed nihilism." And that's correct. For those who want to have an existential crisis and overthrow the board game and start over and burn everything to the ground, historical accuracy doesn't matter, because it doesn't square with the narrative. And that's exactly what's going on here. Now, I do think that Parker really makes some good points here that aren't getting conveyed, which is that history is not something that we necessarily have to be proud of or feel good or bad about all of it, but it's important to understand where, why, and when, and understand how to prevent tragedies and injustice from happening. And that's what we're trying to do here. And when you tear down a statue, you tear down the people who first of all fought to get the statue up, the people who feel represented by it now. I'm sure there are some. And you tear down the remarkable history, remarkably bad and remarkably good history about Teddy Roosevelt. And for 80 years, he was regarded as one of the most progressive presidents in U.S. history by far. And in 5 minutes, he's become a monster. And I'm not really sure how this happened. Now, Parker writes, quote, "I've walked past the statue dozens of times and never much liked it. Too much testosterone for my druthers. And, frankly, I'm not a fan of great white hunters off on a safari to exploit the life and native species of lands not on their own. Like, white people are the only people to do that. Assisted by local talent who treat it as servants. By that standard, of course, there would be no male statues anywhere on the planet, given women's inferior status throughout the bulk of history. I don't think that's true either. That's conjecture. However, she continues, quote, I'm constitutionally averse to depictions of suffering, human or animal, which is fair, and yet I've learned much more from art books and museums about life and history than from all my years in public school classrooms. Some art deeply offends me, is hard for me to look at, and is nothing I'd ever want to hang on a wall. But I don't feel deeply compelled to destroy it. Civilization, at least as practiced here, provides lawful means to change what we don't like. While vandalizing or destroying objectionable property may provide a momentary release, which is exactly what it's about, a momentary release, nothing good comes from letting loose the dogs of anarchy. And that's what I want to leave you guys with today, because that's what's happening. We are letting loose the dogs of anarchy. And who let the dogs out? These Twitter activists, people who are really brothers and sisters of mine, but people who clearly have so much anger inside of them that they can't help themselves but they can't help but have this appetite for destruction. And that's something that really scares me. Thank you everybody so much for listening to this episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. If you'd like to subscribe down below to the channel, that would really help me out. I always greatly appreciate your support and your time and your consideration. You can leave me a comment in the comment section down below if you'd like to give me some feedback or add to the conversation, maybe rebut me in some way or add another perspective. You can also like this video. That really, really helps me out. You can also find me at The Riley Lewis Show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor FM, and Spotify. So there are lots of different platforms to support me and to find my content. You can also visit the link down below to hit my Patreon page, where you can navigate to the website, make an account, and make a donation to me, which again would be greatly appreciated because that's how you can support me. Or you can go to anchor.fm and go to my virtual wallet and make a donation there. I really appreciate your time today, and I will see you here again on Monday. I will not be in tomorrow. I just have some life things going on tomorrow, and then I will be taking the weekend off, but I will see you here again on Monday. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show.